Good afternoon. I am Scott Black, the new director of the Tanner Humanities Center, and I'm delighted to welcome you to the Tanner's first event of the year. Today's presentation by Ruth Ben-Ghiat is, unfortunately, very timely. Dr. Ruth Ben-Ghiat is an eminent historian of Italian fascism in the early part of the 20th century. She is professor of history and Italian at NYU and recipient of many fellowships and awards, including a Guggenheim. She has published important studies of fascist culture under Mussolini, and in particular the use of cinema as a tool of authoritarianism. But most of you are not here to hear about history. You are here because of Dr. Ben-Ghiat's latest book, Strong Men, which traces the history of authoritarianism from Mussolini and Hitler through Franco, Pinochet, and Gaddafi to Putin, Modi, Bolsonaro, and Trump. Dr. Ben-Ghiat has been an important voice in the media, helping us understand the larger context and moves of the authoritarian playbook. She writes a Substack newsletter called Lucid that is a crucial source in explaining threats to our democracy. Today, Dr. Ben-Ghiat will give an overview of her work and then be joined by Dr. Jackie Sheehan for a conversation about strong men. Dr. Sheehan is assistant professor of Spanish in the U's Department of World Languages and Cultures, as well as a former Tanner Fellow. She specializes in the culture and cinema of Spain in the Franco and post-Franco eras. After their conversation, there will be a brief Q&A with the audience, and then Dr. Ben-Ghiat will sign books in the lobby. As always, many thanks to the O.C. Tanner Company for their generous support of the Tanner Humanities Center, which makes possible this talk and all of our programming. Now please join me in welcoming Dr. Ruth Ben-Ghiat.
Thank you. I'm just going to clear my throat. I'm on a speaking tour for the election, and excuse me. So thank you, Professor Black, Professor Sheehan, and everyone at the Tanner Humanities Center. I'm so glad to be, that was involuntary. Your beautiful campus, and your beautiful city. So we're living through historic times when the global clash between democracy and autocracy seems to be coming to a head. Authoritarianism is ascendant, and recent VDEM Institute and other Freedom House studies have shown that up to 70% of the world's population now lives under some form of a liberal rule. And it's a continuum, right? So all the way up to a kind of totalitarianism like in North Korea, but 70% of the world's population. And yet, this spread of illiberal rule has sparked an unprecedented wave of resistance in the world. We're living through a global renaissance of nonviolent mass protest. We have a revival of labor actions, movements for racial justice, for climate justice. So strongmen leaders don't just endanger democracy, they pose an existential threat to humanity. And many people are responding to that. The U.S., it's quite a time to be living in this country. The U.S. has become a key front of this global clash between tyranny and freedom. And history is unfolding in America as if on a split screen. And I see this election as unprecedented. It's not primarily about policy, although policy is important, obviously. It's really a referendum of what kind of political system we're going to live in. Will it be continuing our democracy or some version of autocracy? And it looks different everywhere it unfolds, but that's what I see as the stakes. And that's why it's more important than ever to understand autocracy in its various forms, how strongmen leaders think and how they operate. Knowing their playbook, the patterns that govern their behavior, allow us to see who they are when they first appear, predict their actions, which I've been able to do in some cases, and resist them with maximum efficacy. So for 100 years, people always ask, when do these charismatic demagogues find a following? So for 100 years, they have found favor at moments of uncertainty and transition, when traditional parties and political systems no longer seem to meet the needs of the moment. And that, for many people around the world today, is also democracy. They often come from outside of the political system. Many of them, Mobutu was a journalist, Berlusconi owned TV networks, or they come from reality TV. Mussolini was a journalist. They know how to create new movements and political alliances and communicate with their followers in very original ways. They really are innovators in communication, both the content and the style. Picking up on powerful drives and resentments, they present themselves as the vehicles for obtaining what is most wanted at that moment, whether it's territory, jobs, safety from racial enemies, or revenge for mistreatment by foreign powers. That's the victim complex, which is so important to the strongman persona. Authoritarians also appeal when societies have made recent gains that are perceived as too rapid or too much with gender, class, or racial emancipation and equity. They soothe fears of the loss of male domination, elite privilege, and in Euro-American context, the end of white Christian civilization. Now, conservative elites around the world have been the strongmen's most important promoters and collaborators. Afraid of losing their class, gender, or race privileges, these influential individuals bring the aspiring strongman into the political system, thinking they can control him. And this has been a fallacy over and over again. They strike what I call an authoritarian bargain with the leader, prosperity and safety for them, in return for loyalty, toleration of his violence, and suppression of rights. Those who sign on tend to stick with the leader, no matter what he does, to the bitter end, and they find themselves having to go along with more and more extreme things that happen. But very few of them defect, because there's a big price to be paid. So these can be financial elites, business, and religious elites. I'll give you just an example of the latter case. Putin and the Russian Orthodox Church, a very fine authoritarian bargain. The church has been given huge amounts of money to restore churches all over Russia and all kinds of other things. In return, even as he's pursued this genocidal war in Ukraine, kidnapping tens of thousands of children, like not the most pious of actions, the Orthodox Church has remained his faithful partner. And the more, in general, the more corrupt and lawless a leader becomes, the more he needs those religious elites to surround him with an aura of holiness and give him moral legitimacy. So it's very important. That's just a really clear example of the authoritarian bargain. So I'm going to take you on a little journey quickly, because we have our conversation, of the authoritarian playbook, and start with propaganda. And that's a good quote from Goebbels. And then we'll go to this. Personality cults are extremely important in the operation of authoritarianism. They present the leader, this is a very important duality, the man of the people, but also the man above all other men. So the man of the people and the man above all other men. Someone placed in office by divine will or other transcendent forces to save the nation. Another duality we can get into maybe in the questions, the victim and the savior. That's another one, the victim and the defender. So strongmen expertly use the latest media technologies, whatever they are at that time, to seem omnipresent and godly. So that's the man above all other men. So this is an interesting, Modi, when he ran for office, he used holograms to be in 100 places at the same time. And the hologram is the perfect representation of godliness. You're there, you're everywhere, like celebrities. They are the divos, they are the celebrities. You're everywhere, and yet you're nowhere, right? So that's one. Berlusconi used satellite TV, because he owned TV networks, to be at like 80, 100 places at the same time. So I'm skipping some of these for time. So we're getting ahead of ourselves. Propaganda, and the reason that this personality cult is so important is that having a direct communications channel with followers through these state-of-the-art technologies is very, very important for the bond that they forge with their followers. And that's another thing. Just as the authoritarian bargain with elites, once it's forged, it's hard to break. In the same way, once the followers have bonded with the leader, it's very difficult for those bonds to break as well. And in places where you have a one-party state, like fascist Italy or Nazi Germany, it truly took being bombed by the Allies, I talk about this in my book, for people to start coming out and saying, well, maybe Hitler isn't infallible. Maybe Mussolini isn't always right, because the slogan was Mussolini is always right. So they're very durable, these things that are forged through the personality cult. So, and the paradox of this is the more skilled the leader is at this mediatized politics, the more he's seen as authentic and genuine. Authenticity is very important, and that goes back to the man of the people part of things. So now propaganda may seem to be all about noise, but silence is just as important for its operation. Strongmen disappear people, and they also disappear knowledge that conflicts with their goals. So Chilean dictator Pinochet closed down philosophy and social science departments, saying they were laboratories of Marxism. Viktor Orban has banned gender studies. Everywhere, authoritarians ban books with LGBTQ themes and also suppress climate change science. This is almost universal. And we are living in the US through book bans, restrictions on discussions of racism, manipulations of curriculum, all of that. So it's the noise and the silence. That's both part of propaganda. So machismo. The gender politics of authoritarianism have three pillars. One is institutionalized misogyny. And women are just as much the enemies of the strongmen as the prosecutors and the press and the opposition politicians. Two, hypermachismo, or exaltation of masculinity and brutalist behavior. And they use their bodies, some of them, to become the emblems of this kind of brand of masculinity. And three, suppression of other models of masculinity, other gender identities for men. And there we have homophobia. So misogyny, homophobia, and hypermachismo. Those are the three things. So this is just Mussolini, who was, he came into power years before Hitler. Hitler worshipped him, learned from him, and he was all about, Hitler was more the radio, but he was all about knowing how to act on camera. So here he literally stripped his shirt off. He became the first world leader to strip his shirt off on camera, and he was threshing grain. So he's the man of the people. However, he's not wearing the peasant garb. He's got these state-of-the-art goggles on. So he's modern, and yet he's traditional. So the strongman has to be a figure who is a binding force, who resolves the contradictions of the age, no matter what they are. So he's modern, and yet he's traditional. And he becomes a sex symbol. This is a big part of it. So I don't have my Putin slide, but you're probably familiar. Putin was the one, really, there's a kind of a direct line. I mean, Mao had himself once or twice photographed swimming, so you could see a shoulder. But it was Putin who picked this up after Mussolini and posed with his bare chest, on horseback, that kind of thing. So using the body. Now, Trump tried to join in. Now, why am I showing this? Because this is not a retweet. This is when he had Twitter still. It's not a retweet of a fan who made this. This is directly from his personal Twitter account. So I consider it a personality cult product. So he didn't want to show his own body. So he borrowed Sylvester Stallone's body from Rocky III. So you have the defender of the nation, the fighter, and yet Trump also has the victim persona, right? So that, again, he's got all those dualities. So I just wanted to include that. Okay. And the thing is, we can laugh at these images, and when I show Putin, usually everybody's like laughing or ridiculing, but it's deadly serious because their hypermasculinity is not just empty posturing. It's really, their appeal is their ability to be the men who get away with anything. And they set an example for being lawless. And so this brings us to corruption. So strongmen personalize power. And what this means is their private, political, financial, legal, their legal problems, their financial interests prevail over national ones in the formulation of party politics, of domestic policy, and even foreign policy. So I write, my book starts with the dirty deals of Berlusconi and Putin, which is why there is no Italian translation, and there will never be an Italian translation, because it's not deemed a book that's appropriate for the Italian market. But the personalization of foreign policy is a huge problem with strongmen today in our world. And many rulers of this type, they come into office with a criminal record, like Mussolini and Hitler, or they're under investigation. And I just want to focus on this for a minute, because regular politicians, whether they're conservative or liberal, if you are under investigation, you don't want to run for office like normal politicians, because the journalists will poke around, opposition research, you just don't want to deal with it. If you're a strongman, you feel compelled to run for office because you either have to get into power or get back into power and do, as Netanyahu called, the judicial reform to make your troubles go away forever. So they are really compelled to run for office. So the list of people who have been running under investigation is Putin, Netanyahu, Trump 3 times, and Berlusconi 3 times. And so this is a lot of what they do. This is also the personalization of politics. And it's the same reason, so if you need your government to be to legalize the breaking of the law, to institutionalize corruption, you need criminals in the government. You need to create an atmosphere of corruption that changes the norms for government service. So you use pardons. And this is just an essay from my newsletter on pardons, Pardon Me. It shows that Mussolini, there's a long, long line of these people. Because why should people you need their skills, why should they be sitting in prison when you can have them working for you? So the Nazis used to recruit in prisons and hire people who were very good at bribery and bring them into government service. And the Italian fascists did the same thing. Either people who were lawless or people who were skilled at financial crime and things like that. So and when this happens, and we're in a transition situation, there can be debates over who is a criminal and who is a patriot. And we're going through that now in our country with the people who participated in January 6th. Republicans who are of the MAGA tribe will say that those who are sitting in jail are there wrongfully. They are actually patriots, and they are political prisoners of the Biden regime. Others see them as criminals because they bash the heads in of Capitol Police, et cetera. So, but the fact that this is a debate, so when is somebody a criminal and when are they a patriot? And this is very relevant for authoritarianism. And so we get to violence. So it's a great Putin quote. And he has used all 3, right? So for 100 years, the strongmen and his enablers have led the societies they govern to change. The key is changing the perception of violence. You need to convince people that violence is sometimes justifiable, necessary, and even patriotic. You need to do it to save the nation. Now, many societies are polarized, but when polarization becomes survivalism, me versus you, like we don't agree, right? We agree to disagree. That's within a democracy. Survivalism is it's you or me, and only one of us is going to survive the encounter. So the key is to get people to see the adversary as an existential threat or a primitive force that can destabilize everything. So the prospect of the abyss, that's very important. And that is why great replacement theory is so popular in Hungary, in the US, in Russia. In Italy, the neo-fascist Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni, her term for great replacement theory is ethnic substitution, which is very similar to ethnic cleansing. Ethnic substitution. So it's not just that immigrants are coming and they're having a lot of babies so that our societies become more diverse. Great replacement theory is about survivalism. They are going to make the white race extinct. And that's where, if you play that tune enough, you get people to think that perhaps violence is a justifiable means of dealing with this problem. That's the move that you need to make, and you see how it fits with propaganda and the other tools. All right, the violence that the strongman unleashes is his reaction to his fear. These are very fearful, insecure individuals. This is Lukashenko. When there were peaceful protesters marching in 2020, what does he do? He grabs a lot of weapons, he goes in a helicopter, and he escapes, but he's also trying to shoot at them. That's typical. Because the strongman is secretly afraid of everyone and everything. He's afraid of the people he represses. He's afraid he will be, he will be opposed by a powerful rival. And that's why he builds palaces and bunkers to hide in when his mismanagement catches up with him. The authoritarian playbook has no chapter on failure. And every leader who declines due to his own bad decisions is surprised at his fate and blames everyone but himself. That's kind of a character trait. And Putin was ripe for a decision based on hubris and a lack of objective input, which was invading Ukraine in the way he did. He had become much more vulnerable. The Russian economy had declined because of the pandemic. Young people were disaffected with him. His popularity was decreasing, and his need to, that's why he couldn't tolerate his critics anymore, like Navalny. So things were going in a direction he didn't like. This is when strongmen do rash things to secure their authority and their place in history. They either start wars, and there's a lot of political science research on this, or they double down into conflicts they're already in with ruinous consequences. And political scientists call this gambling for resurrection. When an autocrat is in a bad place, but characterologically they can't pull back, so they go for broke, and they start talking about their grandiose place in history. And this is like a syndrome that they get into. So this is, we see this in various parts of the world today. So that is a reflection of somebody who lived through fascism. It's bitter and fought in the resistance. So to conclude, my background studying fascism made me want to start speaking out. I saw Trump coming on the scene, and it was really when he made that speech in 2016 that he could stand on Fifth Avenue and shoot someone. And for someone who studies fascism and autocrats, he was saying he was associating himself personally with violence. He was capable of violence, and he would be loved and approved of because of the violence. So I started to give a lot of hundreds of interviews, not just to the public, but with journalists, to educate journalists about authoritarianism, because we had the kind of can't happen here thing. But one of the things I learned in writing Strongmen is that every culture who's been faced with this moment has been unprepared. Many people have been in denial, and many of them have thought it can't happen here. Acknowledging that it can happen here means giving up cherished notions about national identity. So, for example, the Germans in the late 20s and early 30s, Germany was one of the most advanced countries in the world for science, medicine, technology, graphic design, art, Many people couldn't imagine that this lunatic Hitler would, do what he did. And strongmen specialize in doing the unthinkable and doing it at scale. That's what they do. The same in Chile. The Chileans watched all these other countries around them fall prey to coups, many US-backed, some not. And they thought, that's not going to happen to us. Our military is loyal to the Constitution. And then it happened to them. So we're no different in that we come to this, whatever form it may take, or it has already taken, the things that have already happened, in feeling that can't happen here. And those who talk about it are speaking in hyperbole or exaggerating. So, but I think, to conclude, the strongmen like Putin and others are doubling down now because they know they're aging out. Their time is limited. They don't have successors. These are not people who groom successors. They can't. And their scams are being revealed. That's why there's so much opposition and nonviolent protest in places you never get nonviolent protests, like China, Belarus. So they're rapaciously clinging to power because they are the old paradigm of leadership, and they must do their best to block the new one from emerging. And this gives us an opportunity, the more we know how to oppose them and where they are, psychologically also. It's time for us to give democratic heroes and leaders the star treatment that's now lavished on strongmen to support other models of exercising authority and other ways of being a leader. We have to develop models of power that see care, collaboration, and compassion as strengths and not weaknesses. It's not easy, but there's way too much at risk for us not to try. Thank you.
All right, well, thank you everyone so much for coming, and thank you, Ruth, for that lovely talk. I really like how you ended, actually, so we're going to kind of pick up where you left off. Of course, you're a specialist in Italian fascism, right, in Italian history. So that's your background, and she's written extensively about Italian cinema, especially in the way that Italian cinema works to support the propaganda of the regime, of the Mussolini regime. So you've got, your first book is about fascist modernity. It's about how fascism in Italy both saw itself as this kind of new model while also having conservative values. And your next book, Empire Cinema, or your monograph, was about cinema in Africa during Mussolini's rule, and how that created this image of empire during that time. So you were very focused for a long time on Italian fascism, and then you shifted to authoritarianism more broadly for this book. So as a historian of Italy, now you're bringing a comparative methodology, which is really what my training is in comparative literature. And I think that's one of the reasons why I loved this book so much, actually. And so for those of you that haven't read it, you can get a copy in the lobby or at our library. And I just wanted to go over a little bit how this book is organized, because you've called it, in your lecture, you were talking about a playbook. And I think that's exactly what this book is doing, is it's making comparisons throughout time and space. So you cover both the 20th and the 21st century. And you write about 17 different protagonists, as you call them. And they come from some different political ideologies, right? So they're not all fascists. There's kind of different stripes of authoritarianism or autocratic leaders in your book. And so you have different chapters. First, it's kind of about how they get to rule, and then how they maintain their power through things like propaganda, through the cult of masculinity, through violence, as you mentioned in your talk. And each chapter compares together these different regimes instead of doing like a case study of Putin about violence, and then later a case study of Berlusconi, for example, is another leader that you focus on about virility. So I think that's what's really interesting, is that the comparisons take place in each chapter, right, with each of these categories. So my question has to do with what have you learned? What was this process like, going from a historian of Italy specifically to this larger comparative perspective? What do you think it really brought out for you? It just struck me how lucid some of these comparisons were that you were making. And also, what type of resistance have you faced to this type of study?
Thank you. Believe me, it would have been a lot easier to just have a chapter on Mussolini done, a chapter on Hitler done. But I really saw this book as a book of civic education. It was my first trade book, as well as being my first book of global scope. And so I wanted to I do have the the kind of playbook of how they get to power, and it's divided into, like, there's the fascist era, the military coups, the right-wing military coups, and then what I call the 21st century people, right? And so I wanted people to come away, and then with the tools, the propaganda, they all go over a century. I wanted people to be able to see what stays the same and what changes. What effect does social media have? And one thing that stays the same are these personality cults. It's crazy. Like the dualities I mentioned, the man of the people, the man above, and they actually span. I decided to stay, except for Gaddafi, I did right-wing authoritarians, partly because I come from study of Italian fascism. I also did not see any book out there that went through the arc of 100 years. Well, what happens after the death of Mussolini and Hitler? What happens to all these ideologies? So it was very enlightening for me to go to the age of military coups and say, oh, they're all, we know that Nazis were in South America, but how did this really affect things? And then on to people like Bolsonaro and others. And now we have the post-communists like Orban and Putin, who have actually, are recognized as pretty right-wing now, and line up in their demographic and racial things with right-wingers. So I wanted to make that genealogy. And to anticipate some of the receptions. So people would, when the book would first come out, or I still get these, people would come up to me and say, well, you must be a commie because you think that, you didn't write about any communists. And so then after a while of this, I went to some colleagues who wrote histories of communism, and I said, when you do, presentations, do people ask you why there aren't fascists in your book about communism? And they're like, no, it's a whole different thing, right? But ultimately, a lot of these things, like the personality cult, not only have they not changed, they span the political spectrum. What Xi Jinping is doing, he's the man of the people and the man above all men. So that was very interesting to me. But I also wanted to show how does corruption change? Now we have the old model for the thieving dictator. You would just put your gold in a Swiss bank. Now there's the whole offshore system. And democracies are very implicated in that. Offshore system wouldn't exist, and many kleptocracies wouldn't, like Putin's, wouldn't exist without democratic people living in democracies propping it up. So that's why I did it the hard way, making every chapter go over 100 years. So you revisit the people for each tool, and you can dip into it. And so that ruined the narrative storytelling part for some, and it was challenging to do the transitions as a writer. But I think that as a learning tool, I've heard from hundreds and hundreds of people that it's helped them to understand, so I feel okay about that.
Great. I agree. I think that this, it really shows us what concepts are portable in this kind of repertoire of authoritarian regimes and what concepts carry over, right? And there's certainly differences, and you highlight those as well. But I think it helps us kind of find or identify how these concepts are returning, right, in the present day. And as someone who studies particularly the Franco regime, which had such a long life, so it started together with the other fascist regimes in the 1930s, with Hitler and Mussolini, they're all allies, right? But Franco's the only one that survives World War II. And so I think Spain in particular is a really interesting case study of how fascism also evolves over time to kind of make itself more palatable for the post-war context.
And Franco kind of won the dictator lottery because he lasted 35, 36 years. He died in his own country, didn't go into exile. He was able to kind of partly be negotiating the successor only when he was on his deathbed, of course. So nothing bad happened to him. And Spain is still living with the legacy of all of that today.
Yeah, that's right. He was buddies with both, Hitler and then with Pinochet, right? So he's kind of like the link between those two periods that you talk about, right?
If you want me to, I didn't really answer the global thing, the comparative thing.
Go ahead.
I think that coming from, so I did, one country, and I always put Italy in comparative perspective, which nobody cares about Italy, sadly. Just to be frank, I'm speaking as a former chair of an Italian studies, the biggest Italian studies department, or one of the biggest in the whole country. Very proud of that. However, nobody cares about Italy. So you kind of have to put Italy into larger perspective. So both my books talk about, Italy and how in the 1930s Italian fascists were they were kind of measuring the 5-year plan of Stalin. They were journeying to America, and it was all like a kind of investigation about modernity. But really, the point I want to make is writing this book, which was global, and then, then turning my eyes, or in the process, turning my eyes on my own country. I'm born here, I'm raised in California, was very enlightening. And that's been my niche in a way. I look at America. I'm not a U.S. historian. My parents are immigrants from two very different places. Of course, I learned some U.S. history, but I'm pretty ignorant I didn't pay that much attention to state houses and even the Constitution. So I've been able to go and look at all of these things with the eyes of, in a way, of an autocrat, of the autocratic playbook. And you see that when these people come in, they scan the system to see what its weaknesses are. Where can they exploit? How can they get power? How can they amass power? And seeing America with the eyes of abroad helped me to evaluate Trump very early. I didn't show a slide where I started writing about Trump in 2015, 2016. And for a while, nobody wanted my pieces. I wrote a piece about Trump in January 2016. He didn't even have the nomination. It was so early. And I was like, he's going to have a personality cult that's going to be like Putin's and Berlusconi's. Of course, no one wanted this piece. It's like, are you crazy, right? But indeed, he has developed this incredible personality, robust, durable. He's been out of power for a long time, and he's still treated like a god. It's incredible what he has done. So it has helped me to make predictions, to see things very clearly, because I had this comparative angle. That's not just about if Trump calls people vermin and does things that are fascistic. I don't call him a fascist, actually. I don't call him a fascist, although he takes from fascism. But he also takes from Xi Jinping. He's very enmeshed with Xi Jinping, and he was funded by the communists while he was president. So he's an authoritarian. He's not, it's reductive it could be satisfying for some people to say, yeah, he's a fascist, but it's reductive. He's more. So that's the kind of, I've been able to have that comparative view, and I think it's allowed me certainly, and I know some others, to see America. You can see things in a new light that perhaps you didn't see before because we took them for granted or we didn't pay attention to them.
Yeah, and it brings out these kind of commonalities, right, between all of these different figures. And that was what I appreciated also so much about the book, is that one of the categories that you draw out here is the man side of the strong man. So I wanted to draw the discussion to gender. And you mentioned this in your talk too, because you're talking about those dualities that the leaders are both a man of the people and the man above all men, right, was one of the things that you said. In your book, you talk about how this is kind of a complex form of masculinity because they're both passionate and they show emotion, but then there's also this cult of virility that's happening. So it's this very complex way. And as far as I'm aware, this is the first book to include such a broad comparison that includes the gender category so prominently. And it was something that really stood out to me about how these figures use their masculinity as a tool, essentially, for autocratic rule. And I wanted to just read a quote from the book because I think you say this better than I do. But this is on page 120 of your book. And I think this quote just shows kind of the power in that comparative perspective that you have. You say, "The strong man would be nothing without bodies to control. He needs crowds to acclaim his projects of national greatness on camera, taxpayers to fund his follies and private bank accounts, soldiers to fight his wars, and mothers to birth all of the above. Far from being a private affair, the sex life of the strongman reveals how corruption, propaganda, violence, and virility work together and how personalist rulers use state resources to fulfill their desires." And you give examples to support this, and you go on to say, "His machismo is not just empty posturing, but a strategy of political legitimation and an important component of authoritarian rule." And this just seemed like such an important reflection here about gender, especially as we're approaching a presidential contest that has gender, questions of gender essentially at its core. So I wonder if you can talk a little bit more about gender and about politics.
Yeah, thank you. And that's a good quote. It is about control of bodies, and unfortunately, these are people who don't care about human life. They really don't. They see things in the aggregate, which is why they do things at scale, but they don't care about human life. Everybody is just a tool to be exploited. And very sadly, when Trump is a good example, in the Iowa caucus, he asked people to come out. He said, "You should come out and vote," because it was sub-zero temperatures. It was freezing. And he said, "Even if you're sick, you should come out and vote. And if you vote and you pass away, it will be worth it." It's like, worth it for who? Not for their families or for them. And there's many other examples one could give. And in that, he is similar. They do not care. It's about, everyone is seen in function of their own, what can they get? Glory, money. But and the gender chapter was rather disturbing to write, but I thought it is the first book that, in all the books about authoritarianism, there's a huge amount of research on gender and authoritarianism and specific issues, but in a book like this, it was the first book that elevates gender and masculinity to be a tool of rule that works in conjunction with corruption and violence. And to do that, I went over 100 years and looked at not only how it's about controlling women's bodies. A big through line of authoritarianism is homophobia, persecution of LGBTQ people. That is actually, that and persecution of nomadic peoples is the through line. Because there are authoritarians like Gaddafi, who, again, he's in there because of his links with Italian things, but he was not a man of the right. He was an anti-colonial coup person. And at the very beginning, he did all these revolutionary things for women. He gave them education, land rights. Then he took everyone's rights away. But he also had a system of sexual slavery. So these people they're complicated, they're complex, but gender is a very good way into their mentality of seeing everyone as an asset to exploit and wanting control. And then, of course, control of women's bodies, the kind of great replacement stuff, the pro-natalist, banning abortion, seeing women as vessels of the state who are supposed to give birth, that ties in not only to racial aspirations of, saving white Christian civilization, but also imperialist ones. Because in Mussolini's Italy, you needed the babies because you wanted to fight the wars, right? And that's reflected in that quote. So it was very dispiriting to write about some of this, and some of these people, it's like Jeffrey Epstein was the head of state, and you use the tools of all of your power of state resources, like your secret police are the scouts. They scout women. And that was not fun as a female scholar to write about. I did a lot of yoga. Well, it was difficult, but I felt that it was important because it's not sensationalism, it's about systems. It's about how they use their power and the systems that they establish with lots of enablers and collaborators to turn governance into something that we would not recognize in a democracy, for sure, under that aspect as well.
Yeah, it was difficult to read as well, some parts of it. And I thought that the gender question really permeated all of the chapters as well. It wasn't just the chapter about virility, but that's, of course, where it's most present. But even with the chapters about violence, we can see that. So I wanted to shift a little bit since we don't have a lot of time left, right? But this book, as you said, was very public-facing. It's a trade book. And one of the things you write in this book is that every strongman targets universities. And so, the university is really the front line of ideological battles. And we can see this, right, in the so-called culture wars that are occurring about identity, about what qualifies as knowledge, about denigrating expertise, right? So there's a lot that's happening. And so I wanted to ask you about how you view our role, and more broadly, the role of the humanities, because the Tanner Center, of course, supports humanities research. What is the role of the humanities in the so-called culture wars?
Yeah, what I found from my research is that universities are often the first place where repressive things are registered, or education is a sector where, for example, in Hungary, which is important because the GOP really is, and not just the GOP, the Heritage Foundation, they're taking Orban's Hungary as a model. They already have at the state level. In Hungary, 2018, Orban banned gender studies at universities. So it was a test case. By 2020, he had a law saying that you could not be recognized as a person bureaucratically if you were a transgender or intersex. So it started in the university, and that's happened. And also, like, kicking out the Central European University, they had to leave. So I think I have in my Substack newsletter, I have a kind of further reflection on this, and I say that often the university is the test case for things, and it's where these things are registered early on. And today there are not only, this is the propaganda as silence as well as noise, all of the, I mentioned before, the restrictions on what you can teach, how you can teach it. There's also very disturbing, mechanisms that have been created to try and intimidate professors into silence. There's Professor Watch List. I don't know if you know, and it's by Turning Point USA, which is, I'm on it. My back to school ritual is I go to my page and I see if what's going on with it. And so they have a photo of my hand is like a claw, they have everyone's photos are like the most unflattering photos. But they updated it with, and under your name is a list of your sins, the category of your sins. So there's a new one now. For me and for some of my friends, like Anthea Butler, I wrote her, I'm like, oh, we're against Judeo-Christian values. So that's like a new category. So they update it, they update your page. So anyway, at the end of this, at the bottom of your page is a helpful note that you should, if you want to complain about this person, you should, call this number. Now, I'm at a private university, I'm tenured, and so nothing much can happen to me, but they've been able to, there are people who have been fired who are at public universities, or their lives have been difficult. And if you study authoritarianism, these are exactly the mechanisms. You want to turn people against each other. And so you create mechanisms, now in this case it's private, it's not the state, that allow that to happen. So that's sad. And then in terms of the humanities, I think that history, I have a history PhD, although I'm also in Italian studies. History is more important than ever, and it's really sad that, and also languages. One of the very, very first public-facing articles I did for CNN was about it's very important to speak multiple languages, to be cosmopolitan, it's an opening to relations that xenophobes don't want you to have. But if we don't, and we see in authoritarian states, and this might be my next book, they try and get rid of histories that they don't like. And so knowing the past allows us to have those continuities, right? They're asking people to just their whole identity is now illegal, right? As a scholar, as a person too, right? If you're LGBTQ, I mean, it just translates into so many things. So I think that perhaps it's inevitable that STEM is where all the funding is everywhere, but it's not a good time with what's going on politically to devalue the humanities. We need it more than ever because of storytelling, historical research, archival, the value of the image. We're such an image culture, so now you're going to defund the study of images in art history and in communications because it's not STEM. That's not good. That's not going to help us confront what. It's not going to help us assess and cover and deal with the challenges we have coming from other realms.
Yeah, I think that's a really great note to end on and to open up to audience questions. I'm reminded actually of what you said in your propaganda chapter, and you're talking about, specifically you cite Hannah Arendt, and you talk about how she says that the ideal authoritarian subject is one who cannot distinguish between fact and fiction or truth and falsehood, right? So this, I think, is really an important part of humanities education, right? To understand nuance and to be able to answer these questions.
Critical thinking.
Yeah, exactly, critical thinking from
Right.
those various disciplines.
The word critical, I mean, in the US, it's critical race theory, but critical thinking is obviously, I mean, the Nazis banned criticism. Like, no criticism was allowed. So that tells you a lot.
So we have some time quickly for audience questions. I think we've got a mic coming out to you.
Wonder, at a regime level, can you draw the distinction between authoritarianism and totalitarianism?
Yeah, if I were a political scientist, I would be going on longer about it. I think now because we have so many variations now, it's a question of degree. The old school, we're talking like old school, used to be that only Stalinist Russia and Hitler's Germany were totalitarian, and then Mussolini was a failed totalitarian, even though he was the first one to use the word totalitarian, actually. And so it's a question of the degree of control you have over state institutions. So in fascist Italy, you had a king, you also had the Pope inside Italy. So on that basis, people concluded, I think wrongly, because each regime works differently, that it wasn't totalitarian. Now, certainly, a nation like North Korea, which is extremely closed, almost autarkic in its ambitions, is more totalizing, right, than obviously some of those. So it's a continuum today. So I think that all of this terminology is in flux right now. including what authoritarian means. So it's a good question.
Donald Trump has been, I think, accurately described as having a narcissistic personality disorder. In your research, is that a common theme among the authoritarian leaders?
Yeah, one of them, so there were a lot of surprises for me as the researcher as I did this, and I did not expect so many common traits among these leaders in general. They are obviously ruthless. They are totally amoral. Don't care about life, as I said before, of others. And they're transactional to the extreme. And this is what allows them actually, they're ruthless, lawless, all these things is what allows them to get power and then keep power. And it also explains, but they're very insecure, like a lot of narcissists. And so they set up rituals and structures of governance that feed this. So they have their inner sanctums. One of the most common things, and I'll stop, is you must surround yourself with sycophants and family members. When Trump had Javanka, as they're known together, and now Lara Trump is the head of the RNC, like that. Who saw that coming? I did. Because you have to have family members because they may not be openly sycophant, but you can trust them because there's paranoia. And so you surround yourself with sycophants and yes people, and that's how you get into these situations where you make bad decisions because you don't have any objective input. But that's one of the pathologies of authoritarianism come when one person who's very damaged gets a disproportionate amount of power. And you can study these pathologies as they affect outcomes, systems. But there's a huge amount of a lot of them are the same in their personalities, which is not a good thing. So.
It's been fascinating watching Donald Trump live. I mean, this is kind of a weird opportunity we have to watch an authoritarian rise and take power. Who is somebody advising him? Does he have a book, Authoritarianism for Dummies, or does he have, I don't know, it seems like there's got to be people saying, hey, you ought to do this, and you ought to target these people, and I don't see him doing all of this in his own mind. It seems like he must have some help. What do you think?
This is a very common question. It's a really good question because we know Trump is not, he doesn't read, right? He didn't even read his briefing books. However, I do believe his first wife, Ivana, he had 2 books in his bedroom when they were younger. One was The Art of the Deal by him, of course, and the other was a book of Hitler's speeches. He's been intensely interested in Hitler his whole life. And so I think that there is this concept called autocratic learnings. These guys watch what each other does very carefully. They learn how much can you get. Their whole thing is, what can I get away with, right? And if they see, so Putin's getting, the West keeps giving Putin just enough, keeps not giving Ukraine the amount of arms it would need to shut down Putin, so Putin's allowed to continue the war. Xi Jinping's very interested in that. So they watch each other, and Trump has watched very carefully. That's why he keeps praising over and over these guys. He's learned from them. He knows what he would like to do and what he would like to import. But it's also like a kind of impulsive. He's not reading a playbook. Now, he has people advising him, but he doesn't listen to people. And if anybody's too frank, he fires them. That's what he did when he was president. And so he's ended up being surrounded by, sycophants and actually people who are more and more fanatic. And I don't know if you've paid attention to the people who he would like to have if he comes back. Michael Flynn. These are I believe that these are extremists. Or Elon Musk as the head of a Department of Efficiency, that's like totally dystopian, right? I mean, please. So this is, you end up, this is the logic of authoritarianism. You spiral into more and more extremism, and you have, the people you start with are often not the people you end with, but you're learning along the way from what you've been able to get away with, and what the pushback against you has been. And if you don't have pushback, the narcissist, to follow up, sees that as permission to proceed further and escalate. It's a question of limits.
I think we have time for one more question.
If Donald Trump becomes the authoritarian leader of this country, it will not be because he seized power. It'll be because enough people will have voted for him, which seems to me to be not the case of other authoritarian leaders who find ways to grab power independent of their support. Do you have a theory of why Trump commands the allegiance of so many Americans, which really is the source of his possible access to that kind of power?
You know, there have been a lot of coups, and I'm teaching a class on coups, a new class right now, but a lot of authoritarians have gotten in legally. They've either been appointed, like the fascists, or they've been elected, and it's over time they become more authoritarian. And the same with Erdogan in Turkey, who I study a lot, who we don't talk about enough. I don't want to go on my Erdogan tangent, but it would be easy to do. And so this is where people don't expect them to do things. They can't envision what could happen. And now in terms of the other part of your question, I really see Trump as one of the most successful propagandists in history. He's a brilliant propagandist. And although he goes off on tangents and he confuses things and he talks nonsense, it's not an either or. He also has, from 2015, he's had certain vectors of his rhetoric. One has been to change the perception of violence. Over and over, he uses his rallies to radicalize people and to bond them to him. He tells people he loves them. He also tells them he doesn't care if they die, but that's also part of the thing. I mean, Mussolini did the same thing. He would humiliate people, both the elites and then he also would, kind of, he didn't tell them he loved them like Trump does, but Trump told people on January 6th that he loved them, right? So they established these bonds, but he's been a brilliant propagandist, and he has taken people on a journey that praising authoritarians, saying Xi and Putin are brilliant over and over. I've attracted 85 times for Putin, 60 times for over and over. And then in the old days, you used to be able to beat people up over and over with violence. So people have responded, and the Overton window has shifted. The permissible has shifted, and he's been absolutely brilliant at this. So people who say he's just crazy, there's no explanation. And of course, he's had Fox News. It's not just all about him. He wouldn't have had succeeded without Fox News and the GOP. That's a whole other story. You need those enablers. That's why I talked about the authoritarian bargains. And why do those people, some do it for profit, some do it for careerism, and some people are afraid of him because he's a very dangerous person. So.
Thank you all.